My name is Tatiana Zarate Barrera. I am an assistant professor of economics at the Bush School, and I have the honor of moderating this discussion today with our guest. We are delighted to have with us Elisa Zogbi. Elisa Zogbi is the Director of South American Affairs in USAID's Latin America and Caribbean Bureau and the Principal Officer for Venezuela. She supports development programming across 5 missions in South America and leads USAID efforts to support a democratic transition and protect human rights in Venezuela. She began her USAID career as a Foreign Service officer in 2011 and has nearly 20 years of diverse international development experience. Elisa has served in Paraguay, El Salvador, Colombia, and the West Bank and Gaza, where she led diverse bilateral and regional teams to promote key democracy and governance reforms, expand access to education, improve citizen security and rule of law, and advance peace. She has almost a decade of experience assessing the impacts and designing strategies to address changes in migration flows in the Western Hemisphere. In El Salvador, Elisa was a key contributor to the design and implementation of the root causes strategy for Central America. In Colombia, she stood up the Venezuelan Response and Integration Office, where she designed and oversaw multi-sectoral programming to regularize and integrate the mass influx of Venezuelan migrants. Prior to joining the USAID Foreign Service, Elisa worked for Chemonics International as a project manager in Latin America and the Caribbean region at headquarters, and as a program officer on the USAID-funded Strengthening Democratic Institutions project in Bolivia. Elisa has a Master of Arts degree in Political Science from the University of Kansas, a Master of Science in Development Management from the London School of Economics and Political Science. She grew up in Sugar Land, Texas, and speaks fluent Spanish and rusty Portuguese. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Elisa Zogbi. Thank you. So thank you again, Ms. Zogbi, for being here today, for traveling up to here. We really appreciate it. So to start and to break the ice, could you please tell us a bit more about your work in Latin America right now? What are your current projects?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for coming tonight. I'm really happy to be here. I'll just say, as a native Texan, it's really exciting to be back in the state. And working kind of on the other side of an issue I've been working on for many years. As was mentioned, I've been working on migration trends for about 10 years in different places. I was in Central America for 5 years, working in El Salvador and northern Central America and looking at the root causes and reintegration of migrants. And most recently, prior to moving back to DC, as I was in Colombia at the start of the big influx of Venezuelan migrants into South America in particular, and was there still when in 2021, 2022, Venezuelans also started coming at much higher rates to the US border. So worked on both of those issues. Back in Washington, I have the privilege of covering a larger number of countries, so I'm still working to support our efforts in Colombia and the migrant integration efforts there, but also in Peru, Brazil, and Ecuador. And then as well, one of my, probably where I spend 70%, if not more of my time is on Venezuela itself, which one could say is another form of a root causes strategy, is looking at what we can do in Venezuela to make it a better place for Venezuelans to live and thrive and feel safe, so that they're not continuing to leave across the region and to the United States.
Well, that's a lot of moving parts. I bet you are super busy most days, right? So for those in the audience who might not be familiar with USAID's work, Could you please explain USAID's mission and its role in foreign policy for the U.S.?
Sure. So USAID is the United States Agency for International Development. We are one of three, we call them the 3Ds. I don't know if you've heard of this policy. We talk often about diplomacy and defense, and there's a third very important piece of our foreign policy, which is development. Now, with this administration, USAID has a seat on the National Security Council, so it is very much part of our foreign policy abroad. Our focus is abroad. It is to invest in countries to help them develop, help people thrive in those countries, but all with the purpose of making us safer in the United States. So 8 out of 10 of our primary trade partners did receive USAID assistance in the past. So we are helping to develop countries to partner with us in a better way, and that helps us increase our economy here in the United States. We've also helped to stop diseases from spreading across the world. That also keeps us healthier in the United States. And then we focus on things like security, and if we can make places safer abroad, then those countries will also not generate more criminals that then go around the world and create trouble for us here and in other countries overseas. So we are the primary implementer of foreign assistance, which is less than 1% of our national budget every year. It sounds like it's a lot of money when I put it into millions and billions of dollars, but it's really not a lot when you look at how much we're investing in different developing countries across the world. USAID has 2 primary kind of branches of assistance. One is humanitarian assistance, and that's where a really large portion of our budget goes. Those resources go to save lives in immediate danger. We're responding to natural disasters. We're responding to, right now in South America, if you all have been watching the news, there are forest fires that are uncontrollable and some lives are at risk. We're providing assistance there. As well as with the Venezuela migration crisis, we were providing food assistance to help stabilize those populations. But on the other side, our really core aspect of our work is development. And so that assistance is longer term. We don't provide food and just to save lives on a daily basis. We're building systems. We're working with national level governments, with municipal governments, with the private sector, with civil society organizations to develop their capacity to continue to deliver the services over time and to help their economies flourish so that their citizens can find jobs. And really importantly, related to the work that I do in Venezuela, but my own background and why I got into this is to promote democracy abroad and to make sure that citizens' voices are heard and that they can participate and fight against corruption and live in a safe place.
So you mentioned that migration is one of the main, not the main issue that USAID deals with, but recently migration in Latin America has been dramatically increasing, right? So before going to specific initiatives or programs that you have worked on, could you please give us a sense of the scale of migration in the region?
Sure. I'll speak more to the newer challenge that we face as a region, and it really is a regional problem. Almost 8 million Venezuelans have left their homes since 2015. And of that population, 5 times more than how many have reached the United States are actually living in other Latin American countries. And so all the countries in the region, or many of the countries, are actually receiving migrants in a way that they never did before. We in the United States are used to immigration waves. Our country was built on immigrants, and in Texas, we know very well that immigrants are coming over every day and have been for decades. A country like Colombia or even Peru never received migrants. They didn't know what that meant. The Colombian government thought of themselves as an exporter of migrants. Colombians escaped conflict. They were going to countries like Venezuela and other places to find their own livelihoods and protection. And suddenly they were faced with a country that only has about 45 million people, 2 million migrants, in a very short span of time. So if we put it into perspective, it's really a large volume and highly vulnerable group, and coming in all at once. So it's not a trickle effect, it was a very large wave. And so, but to your point, migration was not something that at USAID, when I entered into the agency, I don't think we used that word often at all. You barely heard the word migration. We did deal with internally displaced populations in many countries where we're working where there was conflict, which is often a precursor for outward migration. But it was really in Central America, and the unaccompanied children crisis, which some of you may remember in 2014, when the US border was receiving those waves and of highly vulnerable children without their families and going through very difficult journeys to get there, we started saying, what is the role of development in this? How is development impacting these migration flows, and how are these migration flows impacting development? So we started looking at we started to understand that in Latin America, in the Western Hemisphere, and now many parts of the world are doing the same, we can't do development if we don't talk about why are people leaving, why are people coming, and what would make them want to stay.
So we were talking about the push factors later today, but you mentioned about the response of Colombia to migration, right? In particular, Colombia's temporary protection status for Venezuela has been seen as a very progressive approach to manage large migration like flows, right? Mm-hmm. So could you please explain to the audience today what is this program about, and specifically how USAID collaborated with the Colombian government and the local authorities to implement that plan?
Sure. There are not many times, I think, as a Foreign Service officer that travels the world that you can be actually so proud about an initiative that's actually had real impact on people, and this is mine. Hopefully I'll have another. When I arrived in Colombia in 2019 and these flows were uncontrollable, the Colombian government, as I mentioned before, was not experienced with migration. Their first reaction was, whoa, we can't do this. Bring in UNHCR, bring in all the UN agencies, provide them with food, shelter, somebody handle this, and it'll be over soon. As time went by, we had good data that showed that the migrants coming in had no intention of leaving. So you had 2 million people that were living on the streets. They were using emergency health care services. The Colombian government had accumulated more than $100 million in debt in paying for the health service. They couldn't turn away a pregnant Venezuelan woman who was at risk herself and the baby's lives. They were taking care of the migrants, and they didn't have the systems to do it. But the interesting thing is that a country that hasn't had experience with migration also didn't have a political burden like we often do in the United States. We've been dealing with it, so there are a lot of perspectives here. There was no real perspective on migration. It wasn't a political issue. It was, these people are staying, what do we do about it? We were able to provide data and show, for example, in the healthcare system, if you integrate these migrants, then they'll be part of your healthcare system. They will no longer go to emergency services. They will have access to preventative care. And overall, like a regular insurance scheme works, you will pay less per capita for these migrants. If you help them become legal and get jobs, and they can pay for those healthcare services, they can get off of the subsidized portion and start paying into the healthcare system. That generates revenue for your own Colombian healthcare system. Then they can pay taxes, then they create jobs. We were able to have these technical discussions that are so difficult in some scenarios. And the Colombian government understood, and one more factor, security. There, of course, with any large migrant population, especially vulnerable ones that don't have access to economic opportunities, you're going to see some crime. Per capita and in comparison to the population, it actually wasn't high. And that's what we see in most contexts. But the reality is, if you have undocumented individuals committing crime, you can't hold them accountable. So Colombia decided we want to provide legal status to these migrants. We're going to be able to hold them accountable. We're going to keep our country safe, and we're going to benefit. Colombians' age dividend is growing. but Venezuelans are a younger population. They're like 70, I can't remember the exact figure, but the percentage of their population that's of productive age is much higher in Venezuela than it is in Colombia. So they said, we're going to take advantage of this youth bulge, and we're going to integrate them. And by the way, we don't have a choice. So what are the costs of not integrating them? That was Colombia's perspective. So they, with our support, created a temporary protective status program, which has the same name, but a little bit different than the United States temporary protective status programs. And then this one was a 10-year program with pathway to citizenship. This was a long-term plan. And it gave them rights to, I remember former President Duque, because there was a concern about their ability to vote. In every speech he'd say, they have all the same rights as Colombians, except for the political ones. They did not have the right to vote, but they had rights to receive basic services. They had the right to work. They had a right to pay taxes. They had an obligation to pay taxes. And so they did that, but that's not enough. So the temporary protective status program provided them with legal status, and it was very challenging to actually reach the migrants that have been lived in the shadows for so long, to reach them, to get them regularized and into the system, just to get their ID cards. Then you had to get them into the health system. They needed banking services. Children need to go to school. So with USAID, we worked with the Colombian government at the national level, and then in the 9 cities that received the largest numbers of migrants around the country, to develop one-stop shops, the Integrate model, so it's an integration center. It was led by local governments in the cities, and these are cities in Colombia that have a lot of resources. So Colombia is a country of many colors and many different challenges depending on where you are, but we're talking about Bogota, Medellin. These are some of the largest, most powerful cities in Colombia. They had lots of human capital in the government, in the private sector. So we were able to leverage those things. And with not a lot of money from our US government, we helped them build systems that they could help integrate migrants in those cities. And we saw that in Bogota, for example, 9,000 migrant-owned companies created 200,000 jobs for Colombians and Venezuelans alike in a very short amount of time.
Wow.
And I could name many more other things, but the benefits were huge, and there's still a long way to go.
So what were the incentives that were provided for companies to create those jobs? There were some incentives, or just was the natural flow of things?
They were new jobs. So
Okay.
new companies. These are Venezuelans that came in, entrepreneurs. They created new businesses, and they needed labor.
Yeah.
So there were new jobs that they created. This is not a humanitarian assistance program. This isn't anyone with a bleeding heart. This is, I need labor, so I'm going to create jobs, and I'm going to recruit among legal Venezuelans and Colombians alike.
Isn't it very progressive? And I didn't know how close the relationship with the government was with USAID. So do you have any insight for similar countries in Latin America or in the world trying to do the same? What are the main challenges, and also how we're overcome by the Colombian government so that now it's working better, I guess?
So really, based on the Colombian model, it's really shifted our approach at USAID for the region, and really the U.S. government, I would say, and that's looking at all over South America. So Peru, all the countries where we're working in the region have created some sort of program to regularize migrants. They're never perfect, and they're not covering the entire migrant population because they do face challenges. They face, as time goes on, in particular, they're facing growing xenophobia against Venezuelans. Of course, similar issues that we face here in the United States, the fear that migrants will take jobs, and there are political concerns about their constituents and what they can do and when they can do it. So there's a lot of timing kind of challenges there. But we have seen Peru, Ecuador, Brazil, Panama just announced a regularization program, surprisingly, after a long time. We have seen most countries in the region adopt some sort of program to regularize migrants and initiatives to integrate them into their public services and their economies. And really, in Peru, we have a similar experience where Lima, most of the Venezuelan migrants have settled in Lima, which is, many of you know, very large city. It is the economic capital of Peru, and there are all the things that you would find in a large Latin American city. So lots of money, lots of inequality. So those are the types of, and lots of informality as well. And Venezuelans are participating in the informal economy at the same rates as locals are participating in the informal economy. But we do see many Venezuelans integrating, creating jobs, students growing up and becoming members of society. We see changes in gastronomy in these countries and how Venezuelans have impacted the society, and many really positive benefits. Again, not enough, and it's a large volume. Again, almost 8 million in the region, including the United States, but the bulk in Colombia, Peru, Brazil, and Ecuador. It's a large volume of people to integrate in a short amount of time. And again, most of the countries are dealing with their own inequality. So at the same time that they're trying to integrate their own population that's been disadvantaged and disenfranchised for a long time, they're also dealing with this new population. So there's still many challenges, but we have seen that it's effective in really stemming some of the flow from South America up to the United States. Because if we can imagine that 40% of them are in Colombia, that's 3 million people. If they can't find a way to stay in Colombia, they will continue and look for other opportunities. So it's really part of our approach to support those efforts.
Okay, that's amazing. So you said that migration has been very fast. A lot of people has arrived. So that brings to mind the issue of social integration, right? So bringing economic opportunities for the migrants is very important, but that's a little bit different of social inclusion, right? Social inclusion is difficult because you mentioned most countries in Latin America don't have a lot of money, right? And also fear and misunderstanding, right, can grow, especially with social media. So what are the initiatives that you have found innovative so that migrants can integrate to the local communities, not only in economic terms, but also in cultural aspects?
Well, I think in Colombia, it's really interesting because they're neighbors, right? Colombia and Venezuela are neighboring countries. There was already a thriving border economy happening between the two countries. There's a lot of marriages between Colombians and Venezuelans. There were also about 500,000 Colombians that moved to Venezuela during the conflict, many of whom came home. So the ties between the two countries have been strong for a long time, and they've been based on really social concerns and kind of a family almost, like you're part of us and we're part of you, versus any economic benefit or any relationship between the two governments. It was really families moving and getting to know each other and realizing that they share so many of the same values, they share some of the foods. So we did promote, where needed, a lot of initiatives at the community level to help that integration process. So with youth in schools, making sure that Venezuelans are kind of playing sports alongside Colombian students, building together playgrounds in the community and helping to kind of spur that community feeling. We also had arepa challenges where there was always a joke about whose arepa was better. I won't tell you what I think, but I think a lot of people would agree with me, but I won't say. But things like that. But there are arepas at the end of the day. So there are things that they share that I think makes it a lot easier. And of course, language. So it's different than in other contexts. And you could see, too, with Venezuela and Colombia, that a lot of the Venezuelans from certain parts of the country that were warmer, they would end up in the warmer parts of Colombia. Those from the highlands ended up in the highlands. So they were finding a place to stay. I will say, we tracked perceptions of xenophobia over the years in many different ways. And it was always very interesting because it exists, has existed, and there were a couple of trends that we could see. One is that there were peaks, and the peaks would happen. So, for example, there were some big protests in Bogota, I think in like 2021. There were some big protests, and there was a narrative that started going around that was the Venezuelans creating the protests. And so, what are the Venezuelans doing here? COVID hit, and Venezuelans didn't have shelter. That was one of the biggest challenges for Venezuelans, was actually finding a place to stay, because in Venezuela, many of them had homes and apartments. They came over, they could get a job or make some money, but they didn't have roofs on their heads. So they were living, a lot of them, in apartments with many people in them, which was obviously not a good idea during COVID. So certain moments, there were peaks in xenophobia. But in general, again, it always existed, but it seemed to exist more as a perception than in reality. So when you talk to Venezuelans, every trip that I made, whether it was to the border, and in the border, I saw it even less, because they would say, hey, we've always existed like this. We go over there, they come over here, my families, my brother, my sister. And when you went into the big cities, you would see it sometimes, but often the Venezuelans didn't feel it. And they felt like they had opportunities, they felt welcome, they felt very appreciative to Colombia for receiving them. So I think it's something that you always have to keep in mind, and it's really about shaping the narrative in a positive way and reminding people of the big picture. Because in any kind of situation where there's something new, someone new, people fear, how does this impact me? How does it impact my family, my livelihood? And sometimes it does affect individuals directly, and one has to accept that and say, okay, this situation is not good for me. But when you take that up to the community level, when you take it up to the city level, when you take it up to the government level, there is really no, there really are only positive gains, especially in the Colombian context for what was happening. And I think when the narrative focuses on that, when you show the successful stories of successful societal integration, successful economic integration, when you see how hard these people are working, that they're creating jobs, that they are willing and wanting to be part of your society, that changes things. So part of what we also did was working a lot with media, helping them understand what's the story you're telling here and why. What are we trying to create here? If we all want to coexist here, let's tell that story.
Okay, yeah, that's very insightful, and I am aware that there are many programs, but I didn't know the details about them. So, and is USAID still working on those programs in Colombia? Okay.
Yes.
And what is the role of data and technology in that? Because I've seen that a lot of the migration flows needs data to know where these people are and how they are contributing to the society. So what is the role of data and technology in this?
There is no one cohesive kind of information system, and I don't believe it exists. It does not exist in the United States. I wish it did, because then we'd have more information as well as about the migrants and where they're coming from. So it's not one cohesive system, but there is data collected in all the sectors. So the health sector has good information about who's using their services, whether they're subsidized or not, whether they're using emergency care or not, what percentage of the population is of their clients are Venezuelan. The registration system is a online system. It experienced a lot of challenges. It's being reworked. They're trying to improve it, but it's a Colombian system. So part of this too is that, again, we're a development agency. We don't create things, bring them in, and print the cards. It's not our job. Our job is to provide technical assistance to the Colombian government, the agencies that want to do this, and help them do it better. So I would say in Colombia, as in every country I've worked in, and probably, and here in the United States, I know that from our federal government, agencies can be siloed. So part of what we do is bring them all together. So when we have a high-level dialogue between Colombia and the United States on migration, we don't just bring the head of migration. We bring the head of the health department, the head of the education department, and city representatives. We get the full picture, and we bring in different data sources, and we can analyze where we are and where the gaps are.
That's a very important clarification, because I guess the main idea or the main message is that the USAID is working to create long-term systems, not to just provide aid and unsustainable things, right?
Right.
Okay, so looking to the future now. So what are the migration trends that do you anticipate will most significantly impact Latin America?
Excuse me. More than they are today. I don't know. That's a tough question. I don't know that I can predict what the next migration flows are. Certainly, we're still watching the events that happened in Venezuela. I think the elections, and there has been some data, survey data showing that there could be another wave of outflows from Venezuela, the results of the elections. We haven't seen that yet, so we're monitoring it. But Venezuelans continue to, I think at the very least we can say Venezuelans will continue to leave Venezuela. The question is how big of a flow will it be? But they are leaving every day, and they're living in very challenging circumstances with no health care, no education, and not being governed by the representative of their choice. So Venezuela will continue. I think we're seeing in South America, I think the numbers of Colombians have also increased over the years. That is still, I think we're still monitoring that and trying to understand, similar to in Central America, what those root causes are. Why are Colombians leaving? But I heard recently today, I think that there's a potential uptick again in Mexicans. I know Mexicans haven't come over recently, or not in the numbers that they used to, and they're seeing some trends coming up as well. But I don't know that we can predict that, because really the causes of migration are varied, and they're so impacted by different things. We have to just really understand that it's not an event that occurs, and I look at the Venezuela context as this as well. It's not the election happens and suddenly everybody leaves. These are people that have been living there under the Maduro regime since 2013. So why would they choose tomorrow to leave? Status quo. So everyone that's making this decision, I think it's the most important thing is just to understand that every person, every family that's making this decision is making it based on a multitude of factors. And most of those factors are entirely out of everyone's control. There are some. We implement policy. We know that certain policies have an impact on migratory flows. We know that family reunification is a really big challenge that's hard to address. And now that's a challenge in the United States because most of these countries have thriving communities in the United States. So there's going to be a pull factor there. And then we know that that natural disasters happen, there's internal conflict happening, and so that's going to affect populations in different ways. I don't know if that answers your question, but we have to monitor and see.
Yeah, so that's why USAID is so important for the region. So it connects to my last question because I will have to give some time to the questions of the audience. So my last question is, why is USAID's work important to Americans here in the United States?
Wow, on migration specifically or in general?
In general.
Okay. Well, I started with this a little bit in the beginning, but I think generally it's important that the United States maintains good partnerships with our allies in the world, and part of that is not just maintaining trade relationships as we do. It is about helping those countries develop. It's about maintaining democracy in the region and having countries that we can work with collaboratively on a series of issues to address problems in the world. And we can do that better when countries are more stable, when countries are democratic, when countries have resources to invest, when they have thriving businesses that we can trade with. So writ large, the role of USAID is really important, and we're very proud, by the way, too. USAID's job is not to keep working with these countries forever, because again, we're trying to build sustainability. So we graduate countries. We try to work ourselves out of a job. We are investing and trying to build these systems so that later they're on their own. And we have many examples even in our region. Panama, before the migration crisis, did not receive USAID assistance anymore. So then things change and we have to readjust. But we try to build the capacity for the long term so that we have long-term partners in the United States that can help us achieve our foreign policy objectives around the world. On migration, I think I mentioned earlier, we are just one piece of the puzzle, right? Migration is a challenging issue that requires a lot of different approaches and needs to be addressed from a lot of different angles. But our work on supporting the countries of origin, in some cases that means in Central America, that means what we call addressing the root causes. That means improving security. That means creating economic opportunities. It means supporting governance in those countries so that Salvadoran youth can say, I want to stay here and I can. I'm not going to get killed tomorrow or have to join a gang. I'm not going to risk my life for that journey because I can do something here. That's important. It doesn't mean we can stop everyone, and that's not our goal. But we can improve the conditions, and that is what development is. And so the more we can improve development in a holistic fashion in these countries, then more people will have opportunities to stay and thrive. And so, and very clearly in the context of the Venezuela diaspora, very clearly, if we don't continue to support, in partnership with the countries that we work with in the region, like Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, Brazil, if we collectively don't continue to support migrant integration in those countries, they will come to the United States. And they'll come in conditions that are worse off than what they're dealing with right now. So it's really critical that we work together to help Venezuelans find a place to live and thrive and use their resources, use that human capital to help those countries further develop. It's a win-win situation.
You couldn't have provided a clearer answer to that question. Thank you very much, Ms. Zogbi. So now it's time to read some of the questions from the audience. So let me start with questions that were sent online. So in the topic of development and aid to respond to high movements of migration, how effective has foreign aid been in Latin America? And I guess a related question is how the US government is addressing the push factors in Latin America in relation to migration.
It's a good question. I think I've addressed parts
Yes.
of this question and with other responses, but I'll change it a little bit. I will say it's a good question to say, how do we measure the effectiveness of our work with migrants? I mentioned at one point, we don't and can't measure our effectiveness by numbers of people that stay or go. Because again, we're addressing one part of that issue, and we're understanding that individuals and families are making decisions based on a multitude of factors. So that's not the measure. But we can measure how many people are investing. We can measure perceptions of youth that are weighing different opportunities at certain age groups. Would you consider staying? Would you consider? And we can look at other factors that we know are the root causes. We can understand what they are. So again, looking at the Central American context, we know that economic opportunity is a huge factor. So we can measure, are we creating more jobs? Is El Salvador creating more jobs with our support, is a better way to say it. Are security indicators improving? Is governance improving? So we can look at what those root causes are and whether we're having a measurable impact on them as a proxy for whether we're being effective in changing options for people. In other cases, so for the Venezuelan migration crisis, the root cause of the Venezuelan diaspora is economic and political crisis in Venezuela. So that requires an entirely different approach. That requires, what we do is democracy support. So we're not working, unfortunately. We do have some funding in health, but we can't work in health in Venezuela the same way we work on health in Colombia, because we don't recognize the Maduro regime. We don't work with the public health system. We can't work with the public health system in a way we would in another country. And we can't build systems when there is no system, when the system has been broken down. So what we focus on is, how do we support civil society? How do we help Venezuelans from within their own country share their voices, vote? As we all saw on July 28th, Venezuelans came out with one of the highest participation rates in history, and they overwhelmingly selected an opposition party. Democratic transition is the push factor, it would be to eliminate the push factor from Venezuela. Jury's still out on that one, but that's how we can measure our effectiveness, is to look at what we understand and what we can measure as what those push factors are in general, and how we're moving the needle on those.
So many of the questions were related to what is the work of USAID in Venezuela. You already clarified that you cannot work there. So that's good. You answered like 3 questions in one.
We do work there. We do work there.
You
but
work
not
there,
on,
yeah? How do you
Oh,
work
yes.
there?
We do support, but we don't, we do work differently. So the majority of our funding in Venezuela is to support democracy.
Okay.
We don't support the types of programs that we would to build to strengthen a health system or an education system or support local economic development, because those require working with the system and the institutions that in Venezuela have been broken down. But we provide elections, we do elections monitoring, we support civil society, we provide human rights protection, which is really critical in Venezuela right now. The repression has increased before and after the election. So we are absolutely doing a lot of assistance in Venezuela. It's just different in nature, addressing the major challenge of Venezuela, which is lack of democracy.
Got it. Okay. So next question is USAID addressing issues of brain drain and the economic toll it has on nations most impacted by migration? So again,
The last part of it.
so
Brain drain from where?
It says, is USAID addressing issues of brain drain? I guess I imagine like brains that are leaving the country, so they don't have any capacity there.
No, it's a really good question. Again, when we started talking about migration in the context of USAID, a lot of very smart people that work for USAID said, well, wait, migration, actually more developed countries, the more developed a country, the more people migrate from them. And that's the typical brain drain you see around the world, where more educated people come to the United States, for example. They come to university here, they get hired by our companies, and they stay, and they take away some really valuable expertise from their countries. That happens. But it goes both ways. And and it's beneficial to both as well, because often when individuals come into another country, there are benefits that I've been describing. There are benefits for the local economy in terms of consumption. We in the United States, and this university, we benefit from international students coming here and living here and spending their money, and that can be attributed to local economic development in many cases. But many people that come to other countries are also sending remittances back to their countries. So often there is still a win-win where part of the benefit is coming to the receptor community, and part of it is still going back to the countries of origin.
Okay. So it's difficult to assess what will be the effect, right, in terms of brain drain in these countries.
You can measure it. You'd have to look at a specific context and look at how many people are leaving, what would be their productive potential in their country of origin, and what their productive potential is in their host community, and how they're spending their money, and how they're investing, and what their growth potential is. So I think overall, we would just say that the benefits are being received by both countries. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So partnerships between international organizations and local communities are very important for migration and development. So could you share some examples of successful partnerships between USAID and host communities that have created economic opportunities?
There are so many examples. As I mentioned, in Colombia, we identified the 9 cities with the highest rates of Venezuelan migrants, and worked with each of those city governments to change the narrative. In some cases, I remember during COVID, one of the cities, I won't name names, one of the cities was ready to get buses to send the Venezuelans back to Venezuela. Other mayors were just using this negative narrative, oh, the Venezuelans are here, what are they doing? We really were able to shift the mindset, and by shifting the mindset, it was first of all demonstrating to them what the benefits were for their city, and then being able to unlock the resources that they had, because again, these were cities with a lot of resources in Colombia. And so being able to open up services rather than creating separate ones, because as I mentioned in the beginning, our humanitarian assistance programs and all of the UN programs that provide life-saving assistance to migrants and other vulnerable populations, those resources come and they're high. That's where the majority of the international aid comes into, but the resources don't stay. They're invested in the people eat, they survive, and you're investing in those individuals that hopefully then get on a track to integrate and become productive members of society. So the way to do that, we don't have enough resources. Even if we spent a larger percentage of our GDP on foreign assistance, we can't do the job alone. So we have to find the partners with the countries that we're working with. But in the case of immigration, and in countries like Colombia that are decentralized, kind of similar in some ways to the United States, those services are being provided by cities. It's not the national government. The national government will create kind of the broader policy, but they're the ones that are responsible for integrating them. Now, if they create a special service for migrants, it's also more costly for them. So if all they do is take the programs that they have and open them up to the population, then we're all leveraging resources across the board and having more of an impact on the population and making sure that Colombians are also benefiting from the assistance.
Okay, thank you. I guess we will have time to one more question. And this question is about, like, we have talked about Colombia and Venezuela and Ecuador, but can we talk about a little bit of other countries in Latin America, Chile and Argentina? What has been the response that they have to this migration? Is it similar or very different from other?
Well, it's interesting. In terms of the Venezuela diaspora, they have received a much smaller percentage of the population. Chile has more, and we actually have a high-level dialogue with Chile on Wednesday between the United States and Chile. And one of the topics is what we call trilateral cooperation for development and migration. Those are the themes, because we don't have a development assistance portfolio in Chile anymore. Chile is a middle-income country that actually has lower rates of inequality and has higher performance on human development indices. So we don't provide assistance to Chile, but we do work with Chile, Argentina as well, similar situation. We work with them, especially my office in DC. We work with their embassies in Washington, and we're connected to our embassies in those countries. It's to track what's happening there, and what we have offered and are working with them is to actually have these exchanges. So we believe that Santiago de Chile can learn a lot from Bogotá, Colombia, for example. These are peers. They're both cities, again, with a lot of resources and lots of economic power. So for Chile to see, for Santiago actually in particular, to see how Bogotá has handled the situation, they can learn a lot. We also looked many years ago, we didn't end up doing this, but Argentina has a history of integrating migrants over time, more similar to us in the United States. So the Italians and other populations that came in, they had a really kind of progressive system at that time. And we looked initially at how did Argentina do this to help Colombia understand and try to address this problem. So we really do work across the region to see where those new ideas are coming from, then where can we demonstrate success and how can we replicate them. But it's a different model with these are countries that we would consider more, all of them are partners, but these are truly partners where they're not benefiting from foreign assistance anymore in the same way that their neighbors are. And part of it's also because they're not receiving the higher numbers of migrants.
So that's a clear example of why the United States need strong neighbors, right? Chile is one example of that. You just work with them, but it's not as much work as working with other countries, right?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for your time, for your experience. It has been an amazing discussion, and I hope everyone learned a lot about migration issues in Latin America. Thank you again for coming today and for bringing amazing questions to the discussion. I hope to see you in the future in other events, and have a wonderful evening.